Hello and welcome back to the Toffee Blues YouTube channel, your source for all things Everton. My name is Thomas, back on the channel today, joined by the Esk from Twitter, or Paul. If you don't know him already, I'll be very shocked. He's been on the channel quite a few times now, has a good presence on Twitter and his own podcast that he does as well. We're going to be talking about some of the finances that are going on at Everton at the moment. Obviously, we know there are bigger concerns in the world that have caused these things, but aside from that, we're here to talk about Everton Football Club. Look, it's a very tricky time on the pitch at the club. I'd imagine off the pitch there's been some troubles that have maybe arisen that were not foreseen a couple of months ago. We'll probably briefly talk about the director of football as well, that has kind of come in under the radar purely because nothing's been going right on the pitch. But as I mentioned, Paul, thanks for coming on today. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. I just think you're being entirely negative there, and everything's going well with the club. What are you talking about?
Yeah, okay. We'll make a start then on on the USM fiasco as it's been described to me. Obviously, we know about the state of affairs in Russia and Ukraine, the links that Usmanov had to the football club, the links that obviously our owner Mashiri had to USM. There was a lot of intertwining going on. Obviously, there was quite a bit of financial support that was coming from there. But very briefly, just to start off, Paul, what did we have coming from there, and what do we no longer have coming from the USM and the Usmanov kind of side of things?
Okay, I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because when the moment Mashiri arrived in 2016, an awful lot of Evertonians just said that Mashiri was a proxy for Usmanov, that it wasn't his money, that it was Usmanov's money. And it was only a question of time when he sold his Arsenal shares that he would actually become a shareholder and a majority shareholder in Everton Football Club. Well, thank goodness all of those predictions were wrong, because Usmanov and everything that's associated with him and everything that's associated has become completely toxic. And I think we'll look back on this at some time in the future after the war is finished, after the invasion is finished, because it's not a war, it's just an invasion. And when some sense of normality comes back to Ukraine, we might look back at this as a watershed moment for football generally. Before I talk about Everton, and it might just be that we get some sense about the people who are actually running our game, the people who are funding our game. Now, that might be blown out the window by Chelsea doing a deal with the Saudi media group, which, if they do, it just means that the Premier League and football's learned nothing about what's been going on in the last few years. And, we could have a massive political discussion about that. It's going to be really interesting to see whether they do or not. I hope they don't. And I hope whoever comes into Chelsea, just before I talk about Everton, whoever comes into Chelsea recognises that actually football's got to change, and football's got to recognise that the game belongs to the fans, the game belongs to people like you and I, everybody that's listening to this, who've got previous generations who've supported our club, Everton in our case, Chelsea in their case, and other clubs obviously are the same. And we've got to get back to some recognition that the true ownership and the true value in football is actually in the fans, not in people who buy football clubs for whatever reason. Those reasons normally not totally associated with football. So I think we're in a really interesting part of history, the time of history, as far as obviously from a global point of view, from a geopolitical point of view. But from a football point of view, where do we go from this point forward? If the Premier League allow Chelsea, for example, to go with the Saudi media group, then they're just doubling down on what they've done previously. But if they actually make a stance and say, no, we need a proper owners in, and we need proper protection for fans and proper involvement from fans, then actually we might look back at this at some point in the future as the moment when football sort of turned around and rediscovered itself. Now, as far as Everton are concerned, as I say, a lot of people wanted Usmanov to be involved. A lot of people talked up Usmanov's involvement. Now, how much he was involved unofficially, we don't no, I guess we'll never know. We do know that he met several managers. We know that he interviewed directors of football. In fact, he even interviewed the architect for Bramley Moore at one point, or at least met him. They might argue whether it was an interview or not. So he was involved. He always claims that he was involved because he was interested in football and he was helping his friend Farhad Mashiri. But what's clear is that whatever involvement he did have, he can't have in the future. And that includes the informal involvement that he had, but it also includes USM. And I think it's really interesting to look at what the impact of that is on Everton. USM were funding sponsorship was about £20 million a year, and that included obviously Finch Farm, which was the prominent feature, but it also involved megaphons branding around the stadium and during matches, the women's team, and also the I think it was the shoulder patch, wasn't it, on the training kit as well. So the USM sort of stable of companies had quite a prominent position. I think at least as prominent as Kazoo, who would be considered as to be the main sponsors because they're on the front of shirt, or they are at least until the end of the year. So we're going to lose £20 million worth of revenue from the end of this season. Now, some of that revenue will be replaced by somebody else, so it's not a total loss of 20 million, but it's difficult to see how it even could get to half of the amount that USM were paying. The big impact, actually, there's two big impacts. The first and most obvious impact in terms of USM's toxic brand and why they won't be involved ever again in English football, and certainly Everton, was the proposed naming rights deal with the stadium, which was probably worth somewhere between 15 and 20 million pound a year, and might have been worth that for 10 years, or it might have been worth that for a longer period. I guess we'll never know now, because those prospective deals are never going to come to light. We got 30 million pound as a naming rights option, which meant that USM had the right to do it in the future. That money won't be repaid. That money has already been spent. But the money that we were going to get for the stadium was a key part of the stadium financing. And you and I have talked in the past about how the stadium is going to be financed. It was going to be about £100 million from Farhad Mashiri, maybe 100 million or maybe slightly more from USM, and then the remainder, which could have been anywhere from 300 to 350 million pound, was going to come from sort of what they call private placement. So private investors investing in the stadium and then getting an annual return on it. As a result of USM's non-involvement going forward, obviously we lose that element that's related to the stadium naming rights, but also it actually makes the funding of the stadium, the debt financing of the stadium more difficult, because the debt financiers are going to turn around to Everton and say, well, you're now £20 million light of what you thought you were going to be. But they're also going to look at Farhad Mashiri, and they're going to say to Farhad Mashiri, how much of your overall wealth actually was USM related or was Russia related? And that is going to have a big impact on him. Forbes, the US magazine, global magazine, I suppose, they said that Farhad Mashiri's wealth had increased by 700 million from $2.2 billion to $2.9 billion. And they said that just before the invasion of Ukraine. Well, an awful lot of that money is going to disappear, because whatever he had invested in USM, and he owned 8% of USM, and whatever he had in other Russian investments have got no value at all now in the West, because nobody can buy them. Nobody would want to buy them at this moment in time. And he can't receive any income. He can't receive any dividends from it. The last time, one of the big companies in USM is a company called Metallinvest, a steel company. That paid Farhad Mashiri a $300 million dividend last year. Now he can't access that. He can't access that money in the future, even if they were able to pay it, which they won't be able to do, because a lot of their business was overseas. 60% of their business was overseas, and those markets, most of those markets, have been closed. China, Central Asia hasn't, but the Western markets have. So Mashiri's wealth is being cut by whatever exposure he's got to USM, whatever exposure he's got to Russia. And that could be anywhere, I estimate, from 25 to 40% of his wealth. Now, that doesn't mean to say he can't afford to build a stadium. It doesn't mean to say he can't afford to continue to fund our losses. But it just makes it more, obviously, it just makes it much more difficult. And the lenders, whoever the lenders might be, are going to take that difficulty into account when they make their decision whether or not they're going to lend the money or not. Now, sorry, I'm speaking a lot here, but does that mean that the stadium is not going to be built? No, it just means that they're going to have to find a different way of funding it. The club are committed to building the stadium. There will be points in the contract where we could have got out, but I suspect that now we're so far into the build, we're nearly a third of the way into the build. Mashiri's already spent 100 million in filling the dock, that we couldn't walk away without there being huge penalties for walking away. So we're going to build the stadium. It just means that we're going to have to find a different way of doing it. And that means either finding a lender who's prepared to overlook the short-term difficulties and say, in the long term, this is a sound business, and Everton are going to be in European football, and they're going to be much more successful than they are currently. That might happen. Or it might mean that Farhad Mashiri has to find another investor. So he brings in perhaps a minority investor, so that he doesn't own 94% of the club as he does now. He might own 50%, 51%, 60%, depends on who it is and who comes in. Or he might sell the club completely. They're effectively, they're the options open to him. He either funds the stadium himself, he finds a lender, he sells part of the club to fund the stadium to another investor, so bring somebody else in, or he sells the club completely. What he can't do is do nothing, because we're not in a position where we can let things ride for another 6 months, another 12 months. There has to be decisions made between now and the end of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very interesting, because obviously we're not exactly a club who've had the most coherent financial planning or structure in the past few years, to say the least. And obviously, probably one of the things that the club definitely didn't want was this pretty significant loss in, well, not just sponsorship money, but as you said, Mashiri's own personal wealth, and how that's going to affect things going forward. So we're clearly in a more precarious position than where we were a couple of months ago. And I think something I certainly didn't realise for the first couple of days anyway. Obviously, everyone knows about the links to Usmanov, about the sponsorship from USM. It was plastered everywhere. But that insight about Farhad Mashiri, about where his wealth comes from, and obviously your estimate about how much of that was, maybe people wouldn't be as aware of that, really, because, well, I mean, he's always been a fairly mysterious figure, so unless you dig a bit deeper. But obviously, they could find themselves in a more precarious position. We'll focus on sponsorship for a moment as well, because we know that Kazoo are leaving at the end of the season. I mean, Kazoo just seem to have rocketed up everywhere at the moment, but they won't be continuing with Everton Football Club. The USM sponsorship's gone now. I know there has been talk, I think it was from the CEO, mentioning that there are exciting opportunities coming forward. So I'm not sure how much you know about that, but do you know what the general landscape looks like going forward for sponsorship in terms of club? Because all of a sudden, two significant kind of streams of revenue will no longer be relevant towards the end of the season.
Well, yeah, from June the 1st, we're going to lose £600,000 a week in sponsorship revenue, unless we replace Kazoo, unless we replace USM. So it is significant. Talking to people who are in the industry, the sponsorship market for sports is quite difficult at the moment. Why is it quite difficult? Well, club sponsors feel that maybe there's a global recession coming. Why is it a global recession coming? Well, the economic uncertainties out of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine have an impact. Higher energy costs around all over, means higher costs for consumers. So whatever we buy, eventually the higher energy costs will be reflected in the price of whatever it is that we buy. You can obviously already see it in fuel, but you're going to see it in food. You're going to see it in, consumer goods all around, because they're more expensive to produce, they're more expensive to transport, etc. And that cost eventually has to be passed on to the ordinary consumer. And this is what the sponsors look at. They look at the ability of the consumers in the years ahead to buy their products, because at the end of the day, that's what that's the reason why they advertise, is to attract people to buy their products. So the market is quite soft. This is not just me speaking, but having spoken to other people and doing some research on it. And then you've got the situation whereby, if you want to look for growth, where do you look for growth in terms of sponsorship income? Well, there's still some growth to be had in the gambling industry, because gambling is still growing phenomenally, especially in the likes of China and other places where online gambling is just just rocketing. We saw what happened with SportPesa in Africa. Well, the same is continuing to happen in China, even though it's supposed to be illegal. It still happens. But the club have already said that they don't want to go down that route, because it's not consistent with the club's values. It's not consistent with the values of EITC. So it's difficult to see that we could go with a gambling company. So that's one route that's off. The other route where there is a lot of interest and where there is a lot of money is cryptocurrencies. But again, having sort of I don't know, blue Bitcoin or something written across the front of the Everton shirt, is that something really that's consistent with Everton's brand? Is that something that the club would want to do? I don't know. They might be forced to do it, because that's the only option in terms of either maintaining current revenues or increasing revenues. But if we're looking at traditional shirt sponsors outside of crypto, outside of gambling, it's difficult to see how we get particularly given the performance of the club in the last couple of years or more, it's difficult to see how we get as much as we did get from SportPesa in the first instance, and then Kazoo over the last 2 years. So, we are in a difficult position. There's no getting away from that. I don't accept Dennis Barrett-Baxendale's assessment that we're going to benefit from this, that this gives us opportunity. I just don't accept it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's difficult to see how the club can be in a stronger position now. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how the club's morals are going to be tested going forwards, because we presented ourselves for the past couple of years as kind of the forefront of doing the right thing with the links of Everton in the community. It'll be interesting now it's actually tested. Now those kind of that, as you mentioned, those avenues are now shrinking, and the kind of financing we're going to need is probably only going to come from your cryptocurrencies or your gambling. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how the club operates from here going forward. And one thing that I want to briefly mention, but not dwell on for too long, because I'm not sure anyone needs to think about relegation longer than they have to, but we are in a very precarious position in the league. We, as you mentioned, our performance over the past few years isn't going to be drawing in any significant sponsorship, because we're not a particularly attractive club at the moment. We rarely get good headlines in terms of anything. We definitely haven't this season. So it's very tricky to see going forwards. But relegation is obviously something that does loom over us. In terms of, and this is something I really don't want to spend particularly long on, because it's all very hypothetical and we have to see where we are at the end of the season. But is relegation just the absolute disaster for this football club now?
Yeah, absolutely it is. I mean, let's not dwell on it, because hopefully it's not going to happen. And we are probably only 3 or 4 wins away from not being relegated, because of the three teams that are below us. But we've won 2 out of the last 20 games, so to win 3 or 4 out of the next 12, just from a statistical point of view, and if you look at who we're going to play, it looks difficult. But hey, that's where all football fans at the end of the day have to believe that the team is going to be a success. So let's believe that we're going to be a success. If we're not, just like any other club that gets relegated, the change in income from when you're in the Premier League to when you're in the Championship, it'll cost us something like £90 million a year in the first year, and then that will grow as parachute payments will be about £40 million in the first year. Then they drop to about 20, and then they drop to about 10, maybe slightly more than that, but not much more than that. And that's against maybe 130 million in the Premier League. So you can see 90 million, 110 million, 120 million loss in income over 3 years if we were out the Premier League for 3 years. And of course, we're already losing money. We're not making money, even though we're in the Premier League. So that's even, it compounds it even more. So you end up, we would end up in a situation where if we were to be relegated, that we would have to dramatically cut our costs. And the only way a football club can cut its costs, is by selling its most expensive players. So we would do two things. We would sell the players that we can make a profit on, which are going to be our best players, unfortunately. And then we're going to try and sell the players who are just too expensive to keep. The problem with that, and we'll come back to this, I think, if the situation arises. But the problem with that, of course, is that we've been trying to sell a lot of those players for the last couple of years, and we haven't been able to do so. So their market value, because of the nature of their contracts and because of the nature of the fact that they would be being sold from a relegated club, is probably very minimal, but we would be forced to sell them at whatever price because we would have to reduce our expenditure, our outgoings. So it would be an absolute disaster financially to be relegated, which is why not being relegated is so important, which is why everybody associated with the club, including the fans, we all have to do whatever we can do to make sure that it doesn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like that would be more of a longer video type thing, and I significantly hope that is never a video that you and I ever have to make. Well, as I mentioned, I was about to say I believe it won't, but I mean it's pure hope at this point. We will see, but that is the point of the club. There is so much going on around the club at the moment, but the football at the moment is the most important thing because no kind of losses can even come can even come close to the loss of revenue if we did drop out of the Premier League. But now we are onto a footballing perspective, a man that has kind of gone under the radar, I feel. I mean, I haven't really noticed much talk about him. Thelwell's come in, former director of football, or I'm not sure if that was his full role at Wolves, oversaw their kind of rise to the Premier League, although I'm sure that we all know it wasn't just him doing all the deals, but he has joined the football club. It seems like they've decided to stick with the director of football model that we didn't know what would happen after Marcel Brands, especially considering his limited impact on the club and what he was allowed to do. So I think it's interesting that the new man has taken the job. But if you can provide any insight into him at all, because I know that he spent time at Wolves, he then went to New York for that what seemed to be a very short-lived project, and now he's back in England again, and he's got a very significant task on his job. But if you've got any kind of background that you can offer us, what kind of man is he? Who have we signed here?
Signed a man with a decent track record in terms of finding players. Okay, obviously assisted by the fact that Wolves were very well connected with one or two agents in particular, and he did a very good job over in New York, and he learned the Red Bull philosophy. In terms of they have an identity across the whole group, so they have an identity over several football clubs, but even more important within those football clubs, an identity that is consistent at a junior age, at a sort of intermediate age, at the level just below the first team, and obviously the first team itself. So he's well versed and well bedded in a philosophy which I think should be adapted at Everton. And we talked about our finances earlier. We've got to find a way of relying on two things, which we haven't done successfully. Maybe a little bit better than if we talked about it 12 months ago. First one is the academy, getting players from the academy into the first team squad and then into the first team. Anthony Gordon, to an extent, well, not to an extent, Anthony Gordon has changed that to a degree, because he has broken through, and he's now a success in almost anybody's terms. So he's an example of what can happen. But there's an awful lot of players his age and younger who we expect to come through but haven't yet come through. So one of Thelwell's main priorities is to get the academy, if you say that everybody that's not in the first team is in the academy, is to get the academy players to a position where they can come into the first team. Now, I think the situation is made a little bit easier by Frank Lampard being there, because I think Frank Lampard will give youth a better opportunity than certainly than previous managers we've had. But Thelwell's got to do something with the players, but more than that, he's got to do something with the structure of the academy, and he's got to do something with the sort of one club philosophy, which is the academy's purpose is to develop players, and it develops players for one of two things. One, players that are good enough and are well versed in the way that Everton play football, and therefore can play for the first team, relatively smooth transition from academy to the first team. Or if they're not in that position, they're in a position where they can be sold, and sold either to other Premier League clubs or sold to Championship clubs in particular. And all that is very, very obvious, but it's clearly not been, even if it was a strategy, and I don't think it was, but even if it had been the strategy at the academy in recent years, there's no real evidence it's been successful. So Thelwell's got to make the changes in the academy that make that successful, and he has to remove the big, what are the big barriers? I think if you're coming into any job that requires a huge amount of change, you have to address the really big issues in the first instance. So if he wants to have authority within the club, and if he wants to make changes in the club that actually produce results, both in the academy and the first team, he's got to take the really big decisions very early on in his Everton career, because otherwise you'll just end up a slightly less sexy version of Marcel Brands.
Slightly.
Yeah, slightly, possibly more than slightly. So he's got to address what are the real big issues. And, the elephant in the room is the leader of the academy, is the academy director. We know that David Unsworth is a totally devoted Evertonian, and that's great. But frankly, he hasn't produced the results, and he's had much more time than most people would normally have in football to prove his value in terms of producing teams that play in a way that makes the first team successful, or plays in a way that allows those players to be sold to other people. That's never really been his focus. His focus has been on creating a winning academy, i.e. an academy that wins tournaments or wins leagues or wins cup competitions. And that's well, let's put it this way, that's, from my perspective, is totally self-serving. It's not serving the interests of the club. And I think if Thelwell's going to be have any impact on the club moving forward, he's got to address that issue. And how does he address it? Well, he has to move David Unsworth on and say to David, thanks for your time, thanks for your effort, but you've got to find yourself another football club. And Thelwell's either got the authority to do that now, but we don't know whether he has or not. And if he hasn't got the authority to do it now, he has to have the persuasive powers to persuade the people at board level who, frankly, have protected David Unsworth for far too long. I think it has to be said, for whatever reason, Evertonians and the people within the club seem unable to address this simple issue, that we've had a man that's run the academy for a number of years. He has a great history he has a good history as an Evertonian, as a player.
We've had good times. Together, Paul. We've had good times.
Yeah, okay. But he hasn't achieved the objective for the academy. And the difference now between, say, the next 5 years and the previous 5 years is that we had Farhad and Mashiri's money to say, well, don't worry about the academy because I'm going to buy, I'm going to buy an Awobi or, name any of the ridiculously expensive purchases that he made. I think we've established that we can't do that going forward, both in terms of the club's finances, but possibly even in terms of Farhad Mashiri's finances. So it's really important that Thelwell addresses the academy, and the way to address the academy in the first instance is to remove the biggest problem. And the biggest problem is the person that's running the academy. And I think that's what he has to do. And he either has the authority to do it, or he has to persuade the club's board that that's the thing to do. If he doesn't do that, then, as I say, he's going to be as ineffective as Marcel Brands was.
Yeah, the whole Unsworth situation has definitely baffled me for years. And, not only has he been protected, he's also been promoted, and he's had this new role made for him as head of the academy. I remember a time he was just the under-23s manager. And I remember someone tweeting at the time, and this was 3, 4, 5 years ago, maybe. I can't remember when they won the Premier League 2 for the first time, so I couldn't reference it. But someone said to me, would you take this team or one Wayne Rooney? And I thought that was obviously that kind of struck me, because this is where a lot of us were getting very excited. We'd had this team of young players coming through. They'd won the Premier League 2 twice in a few years. If we look back, I'm pretty sure none of those players are still here, really. You look at players like Morgan Feeney, he was the captain. Lewis Gibson, he really hasn't materialised at all. It is baffling, but that Wayne Rooney comment did stick with me, and I completely agree that the main situation now has to be improvement of the academy. And if that doesn't change going forward, I can't see how we can ever run a sustainable model with Mashiri as the owner, because if we don't have players coming through the academy, if we don't have them improving the first team, or, as you mentioned, being sold for profit, which, if we look back, I'm struggling to remember a player that we actually most recently sold for any kind of significant profit from the academy. We're looking back to kind of Wayne Rooney level. Surely it's a baffling situation that we found ourselves in, and that Unsworth has retained his job for whatever reasons, and he's managed to promote himself, and he's managed to end up in this very good role. But yeah, I agree with you there that the academy has to be the kind of the forefront of his mind straight away. So we'll see how that materializes in the next couple of weeks. But I feel like we've addressed quite a lot today. Obviously, there were rumours about the Liver building being sold, but as he tweeted today, Mashiri wasn't a significant shareholder in that. It might not even be his choice. So there's nothing too significant there. I'm not getting that wrong, am I? I'm not misquoting.
No, it has virtually nothing to do with the football club. There's a German investor called Core State. They own the majority of the building, and both him and both they and him, will have made a fantastic return on their investment. Just owning the Liver buildings for 5 years. And to be fair, they've invested a lot of money making it a much better building than it was. But it's got nothing to do with can he afford to run a football club? It's just, as I say, I don't think it was even his decision. So,
yeah, absolutely. And as much as I enjoy our conversations, Paul, and I hope the viewers do too, they do all seem a bit doom and gloom. But that's basically brought me to the end of my question. I'm not sure if you have anything you'd like to add before the end.
Well, the only thing I can say really is I genuinely try not to be doom and gloom. But I have to say, as I see it, and the only reason why it sounds like it's doom and gloom is because the club has done a spectacularly bad job at running itself. And if that changes, then actually it makes my job more difficult, because I've then got to find more positive things.
Where are you going to get your clicks from then, Paul? Where are you going to get your views
exactly. Nobody will want to talk about us if we're winning our finances, if we're winning the Champions League every year. And if I have to retire on the back of winning the Champions League every year, I'm quite happy to do that. But in the meantime, it is genuinely, I'm just saying it as I see it, as I think how finance professionals outside the club see the club. And that's the way it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would hope more, and I do think more people are now coming around to that idea that it's not you kind of producing the doom and gloom, it's the club producing that. You're just passing kind of the information on to people that maybe wouldn't understand it as much. And now that's really come to the forefront in the past couple of years, and especially the last year or so. I do hope people now realise that it's not your fault. You are just kind of passing on the message that the club have started, and that's very much been the case for several years now. But as I mentioned, that does bring me to the end of my questions. At the end of another, fantastic insight. Slightly depressing every time we meet Paul, but thank you very much for coming on again. For our viewers, if you haven't seen the Esk yet, Paul, where can they find you? Where can they find more about you?
On Twitter, at the Esk, THEESK, and also www.theesk.org. Sorry, not com. That's another company. .org.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed the video, learned a bit more maybe about the situation around the club at the moment. If you feel free to let us know your thoughts down in the comments below about your opinion on the governance of Everton Football Club over the past few years. But as I mentioned, thank you all very much for watching, and join us next time on the Toffee Blues.